By the summer of 1944, the Pacific War had entered its most unforgiving phase. The United States had pushed relentlessly across the Central Pacific, capturing island after island in a campaign defined by exhaustion, heat, and absolute determination. From Tarawa to Saipan, from the coral atolls of the Gilberts to the volcanic ridges of the Marianas, each victory came at a price measured in blood. For the Japanese Imperial Army, surrender was not an option. From the earliest days of training, soldiers had been conditioned under the Bushido Code, the way of the warrior, that held death before dishonor. Captivity was considered the ultimate shame, both for the individual and for their family. Propaganda reinforced this code mercilessly, describing Americans as brutal, barbaric, and merciless. Leaflets and military briefings told soldiers that capture meant torture, mutilation, or even cannibalism. For most, suicide was preferable. Yet by 1944, that belief began to fracture. The scale of the American advance, its overwhelming air power, naval artillery, and logistical superiority, left thousands of Japanese units cut off, starving, and isolated. Entire battalions, once sworn to die for the emperor, faced the grim reality of annihilation. In these desperate final days, a handful chose life over death. When U.S. forces secured Saipan in July 1944, they discovered more than 10,000 Japanese dead, but also the first significant groups of prisoners. Many were wounded soldiers found by patrols in caves and tunnels. Others were civilians who had been hiding with the military, terrified by the myths they'd been told. For the Americans, the sight of surrendering Japanese was rare, almost unsettling. Until then, they had believed, correctly, that most would rather die in suicidal charges or mass suicides than yield. Those who surrendered were immediately separated, searched, and medically examined. U.S. officers, following strict Geneva Convention guidelines, ordered that all prisoners be given food, water, and medical attention. To the exhausted Marines who had fought for weeks under relentless fire, it was an unexpected moment of restraint. To the Japanese soldiers, it was unthinkable mercy. The logistical problems soon followed. What to do with thousands of captured enemy combatants scattered across distant Pacific islands? Temporary camps were built on Saipan, Guam, and Hawaii. But as the war dragged on and more prisoners were taken, from the Philippines, Iwo Jima, and later Okinawa, American military planners realized they needed something more sustainable. So began one of the least-known chapters of the war, the transportation of Japanese prisoners across the Pacific Ocean to camps inside the United States. From ports like Honolulu and Pearl Harbor, guarded ships carried men who had once vowed never to be captured, now crossing the ocean they had once fought to defend. The voyage itself was quiet, somber, almost surreal. Many of the prisoners had no idea where they were being taken. Some believed they were on their way to execution. Others, exhausted beyond fear, simply stared at the horizon, watching the endless gray water stretch to the sky. American sailors observed them with cautious curiosity. Enemies only days before, now silent passengers on their ships. As they neared the U.S. mainland, word spread among the prisoners. They were going to America itself, the land they had been taught to despise, the place of imagined horrors. Few could comprehend it. And yet, as the ships entered the calm waters off San Francisco and the docks came into view, those fears began to shift. The guards were not cruel. The rations were generous. Some even received cigarettes, blankets, and new clothing. There were no beatings, no humiliation, only order and quiet civility. Still, disbelief ran deep. For men who had spent years in jungles and tunnels, the sight of a clean American port, cranes, warehouses, and even distant city lights felt like a vision from another world. They were soon transferred by train under military escort to places most had never heard of. Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, Camp Lordsburg in New Mexico, Camp Kennedy in Texas, and dozens of others scattered across the heartland. The journey would change them in ways no battlefield ever could. These men, once devoted soldiers of the Emperor, were about to see the America their leaders had said did not exist, when the trains carrying the Japanese prisoners rumbled into the heart of the American Midwest. The war they had known seemed to dissolve into something unrecognizable. Instead of iron fences and brutality, they found vast stretches of farmland, quiet towns, and distant horizons lined with trees. The camps themselves, surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers, were unmistakably military, yet strangely calm. Each prisoner was catalogued, deloused, and assigned a number. American officers, trained in Geneva Convention protocol, explained through interpreters that they were now prisoners of war under U.S. protection, not captives awaiting punishment. The distinction was subtle but revolutionary. For many of these men raised under imperial indoctrination, the very concept of protection by the enemy defied logic. The camp gates closed behind them, but what lay within was beyond anything they imagined. There were barracks with wooden floors, showers with running water, dining halls, and even libraries stocked with Japanese language materials. 3 meals a day, rice, meat, vegetables, coffee, were served with military precision. Those who were too weak to stand were fed and treated by army medics. For soldiers who had spent months scavenging insects and roots in the jungles of Saipan or Guadalcanal, the sight of organized meals and medical care felt unreal. They whispered among themselves at night, wondering if this was a deception, a prelude to interrogation or execution. Yet days turned into weeks, and the pattern held. There were no beatings, no insults, no revenge. In time, some dared to look beyond their fear. They noticed that American guards rarely shouted, that discipline was strict but not cruel, that even within captivity, there was an order grounded not in hatred, but in procedure. It was as if the enemy they had been told was monstrous had turned out to be impossibly human. U.S. Army psychologists and intelligence officers saw an opportunity in this. The Office of War Information and the Psychological Warfare Branch understood that humane treatment could yield more than any torture. If a Japanese prisoner began to question the propaganda of the empire, he might also begin to talk. Information about supply chains, morale, and command structures soon flowed from conversations that started with food or simple respect. The Americans also realized that maintaining decency had its own strategic power. Stories of humane treatment spread through new POW arrivals. Some men who might have fought to the death began surrendering instead. Their courage eroded not by fear of pain, but by rumors of unexpected mercy. In several camps, education programs were introduced. Japanese language classes, cultural discussions, and even art and music activities were allowed. The War Department approved a program known as reorientation, aimed at exposing POWs to democratic values and life outside the imperial myth. Newspapers printed in Japanese described world events, cautiously filtered but far more honest than Tokyo's wartime propaganda. Still, not all accepted this new reality. The most hardened among them, veterans of the early Pacific campaigns, refused to believe the war's narratives had been false. They clung to their code, rejecting cooperation and branding fellow prisoners who adapted as traitors. In certain camps, internal divisions led to violence. The imperial oath had followed them even into captivity. Outside the fences, American civilians were equally conflicted. Local newspapers often published stories about the presence of enemy prisoners nearby. Many citizens, especially those who had lost family in the Pacific, protested their humane treatment. Why feed and clothe those who had killed Americans? But the War Department held firm. The United States would obey the Geneva Convention not as a favor, but as a statement of moral distinction, that even in total war, principle would prevail over vengeance. The contrast between these two worlds, Imperial Japan's absolute obedience and America's structured fairness, struck deep into the minds of many prisoners. They had been taught that the Western world was corrupt, decadent, and cruel. Instead, they found decency in uniform and order without tyranny. By late 1944, reports from camp administrators began noting an extraordinary transformation. The same soldiers who had bowed in fear upon arrival were now volunteering for work details, singing quietly as they harvested crops, repaired roads, or built furniture for local communities. In their faces, there was still caution, but also curiosity, a sense of rediscovery, as if the world beyond war had begun to return. For them, the war was not over, but for the first time, they were seeing what peace might look like. Inside the quiet boundaries of the American POW camps, something deeply human began to unfold. Stripped of their weapons, rank, and slogans, the Japanese prisoners were now only men. Men rediscovering the rhythms of ordinary life after years of fanatic devotion to a cause. They no longer fully understood. Each morning began with a bugle call and inspection. The prisoners stood in straight lines, not out of fear but out of habit. Military reflex still ingrained in every muscle. Yet what followed defied their expectations. The guards greeted them casually, sometimes with a nod or even a smile. The cooks joked with them in halting Japanese. The Americans did not treat them as beasts or savages, but as human beings. For the first time in years, they were called by name, not shouted at by rank. Letters arrived through the Red Cross. Some learned their families in Japan had survived air raids. Others discovered their hometowns were gone. In the barracks, men who had once been silent began talking again. They spoke about childhoods in Hokkaido, fishing villages, and the first time they'd worn an army uniform. The barriers of ideology began to soften. Work became therapy. Prisoners helped maintain camp gardens, repaired farm machinery, or cut timber for the surrounding towns. Many were surprised to be paid in canteen coupons, which they could exchange for soap, stationery, or even sweets. Some used their wages to buy postcards, their first voluntary act in years. An American sergeant at Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, later recalled how one prisoner approached him hesitantly to ask a question. "Why do you feed us so well?" The sergeant replied simply, "Because you're soldiers, same as us." That moment, recorded in his post-war diary, captured the quiet power of compassion amid conflict. For the Japanese POWs, this civility was disarming. They had been told Americans were demons, oni, devoid of honor or soul. Yet here they were, sharing cigarettes and laughter across the fence. Many could not reconcile this with everything they had been told. The human mind, once conditioned for hatred, was learning trust again. One small gesture at a time. The tactical angle. Intelligence through empathy. Beyond the human awakening lay another layer, one of calculated strategy. The U.S. Army and Navy's Military Intelligence Service, MIS, recognized early that psychological insight could be as powerful as interrogation. Japanese soldiers rarely volunteered information under pressure, but in an environment of fairness and stability, they began to talk, naturally, cautiously, and often unintentionally. At Camp Tracy, a secret listening facility in California, intelligence officers installed hidden microphones to record conversations between POWs placed together in bugged rooms. The strategy was subtle. Instead of direct questioning, they let the prisoners talk freely, relaxed by the illusion of privacy. The results were astonishing. Within months, analysts had extracted thousands of details about Japanese logistics, morale, and internal command structures. What surprised American officers most was not the intelligence itself, but the tone. The recorded conversations revealed fear, doubt, and guilt among Japanese ranks, emotions rarely visible on the battlefield. Soldiers spoke of their confusion over the war's purpose, the futility of suicidal orders, and their astonishment at America's industrial scale. This information fed directly into Washington's strategic assessments. By 1945, U.S. analysts understood far more about Japan's internal collapse than Tokyo realized, and yet it all stemmed from a paradox. Kindness had proven more effective than coercion. At larger camps like Camp Kennedy in Texas or Camp Lordsburg in New Mexico, officers also experimented with educational reorientation. They provided newspapers, radio broadcasts, and even film screenings, designed not as propaganda, but as windows into American society. Some POWs watched movies depicting family life, industry, and democracy, stunned by the normalcy of what they had believed to be a decadent nation. One intelligence officer later wrote, "They began to see that our power was not only in our machines, but in our spirit, that freedom created strength." For the Japanese soldiers, many of whom had been raised in rigid hierarchy and unquestioning obedience, this realization struck deeply. They saw American soldiers joke with officers, civilians criticize leaders, and still, somehow, the system worked. To them it was chaos. Yet it was a chaos that built airplanes faster than Japan could dream, that fed millions while their own empire starved. What began as observation turned to reflection. Some POWs started to keep journals, recording the strange contradictions of their captivity. "We are prisoners," one wrote, "but freer than when we were soldiers." The Americans, meanwhile, understood the larger stakes. Treating POWs with dignity wasn't just moral. It was psychological warfare. Each act of fairness chipped away at the enemy's belief system. Each prisoner who left the camp questioning Japan's infallibility became an unwitting messenger for American ideals. In this sense, the U.S. camp system became more than a humanitarian effort. It was a quiet revolution in the philosophy of war. Power, it turned out, could be shown not only through domination, but through restraint. By the winter of 1944, the transformation within the camps was undeniable. Prisoners no longer avoided eye contact with guards. They smiled. They laughed. And when news of Japan's worsening situation reached them, they did not cheer nor despair. They simply listened in silence. Something inside them had changed. Something no weapon could destroy. The cultural angle. Propaganda meets reality. For the men who had crossed the Pacific in chains, America was supposed to be a nightmare. In Imperial Army briefings, they had seen posters of caricatured white devils, stories of prisoners mutilated for sport, and tales of Americans who mocked the emperor. The image was deliberate, designed to make every soldier believe that surrender meant the end of dignity, the end of Japan. But in the camps of Texas, Wisconsin, and Idaho, that fiction dissolved. The prisoners saw guards who saluted them after roll call, officers who kept their word, and food that matched the rations served to U.S. troops. They watched American civilians drive past the wire with families and children laughing freely. To men raised in a society of hierarchy and fear, this was a kind of heresy. How could a nation so undisciplined, so casual, have defeated them? Language barriers faded slowly. Many guards learned fragments of Japanese. Prisoners learned English phrases from work crews and movies screened on weekend nights. They heard jazz music for the first time, saw electric appliances in use, and witnessed women working alongside men. The experience shook them, not in terror, but in wonder. Cultural officers encouraged reading and discussion groups. In Camp McCoy, one program distributed translated American literature. Mark Twain, Jack London, and even Abraham Lincoln's speeches. These texts portrayed humor, rebellion, and moral questioning, ideas nearly absent in Imperial Japan. Some prisoners were deeply moved. Others were quietly horrified. To them, the American way seemed both dangerous and liberating. A few POWs began teaching their peers English. Others painted, wrote poetry, or learned carpentry. The camps became small laboratories of cultural exchange, sustained by boredom but driven by curiosity. Letters intercepted by censors revealed a pattern. Many prisoners described surprise and gratitude toward their captors, though carefully worded to avoid appearing disloyal. Still, the old ideology did not vanish easily. Fanatical groups, often calling themselves the Imperial Brotherhood, sought to punish those who showed admiration for Americans. At Camp Kennedy, several prisoners were attacked for cooperating with guards or attending re-education sessions. The Japanese military code had been broken by war, but its moral shadow still haunted them behind barbed wire. Even so, small acts of defiance against the old order multiplied. Some prisoners began sketching scenes of camp life, capturing the sunlight falling on fences or the faces of American guards smiling through fatigue. One artist later said that drawing an American was his first step toward seeing him as human. What? began as cultural confusion was turning into an awakening, a realization that the empire's greatest weapon had been illusion, and that America's greatest strength was its openness. The moral and leadership angle. Humanity as policy. While Japanese soldiers struggled to reconcile myth with reality, the American officers who commanded these camps faced a different test. They carried the burden of maintaining decency while their comrades died across the Pacific. Many had fought in battles like Tarawa or Guadalcanal, where Japanese resistance had been suicidal and merciless. Some had lost brothers or friends to banzai charges and kamikaze attacks. Yet the official order was unambiguous. The United States would uphold the Geneva Convention in full. Every prisoner, no matter what he had done, would be treated as a lawful combatant. To break that rule would betray the very values they were fighting to defend. At Camp Lordsburg, a young lieutenant named John L. Kramer was once reprimanded for striking a prisoner who had refused an order. His superior reminded him, "Discipline isn't cruelty. We win by showing them what honor looks like." That philosophy, simple, firm, and deeply moral, became the foundation of camp life across the country. Commanders understood that how they treated their captives would echo far beyond the fences. American POWs held by Japan were suffering unimaginable abuse: starvation, torture, forced labor. To retaliate in kind would be easy. To resist that impulse was what made civilization endure amid chaos. Many officers wrote later that the experience changed them. They entered command expecting hatred. They left with empathy. The act of seeing the enemy eat, work, laugh, or fall ill stripped away the abstractions of war. The Japanese soldier was no longer a faceless target. He was simply another man trapped in a system of lies. Some guards formed quiet friendships with the prisoners, sharing stories about families and farms back home. They discovered that their fears and hopes were not so different. The humanity that bridged those gaps became a kind of moral victory, a small defiance against the dehumanization of total war. The U.S. Army's leadership saw practical value in this as well. Every camp that ran smoothly freed resources for combat elsewhere. Every well-treated prisoner became proof of America's ethical discipline. Morality in this sense was not weakness, it was strategy. By early 1945, reports circulated through the War Department noting the remarkable conduct of Japanese prisoners and the extraordinary efficiency of camp operations. Behind those bureaucratic words lay something deeper: evidence that mercy could be organized, that decency could be weaponized, and that even amid global destruction, restraint was an act of power. The officers who oversaw the camps did not see themselves as heroes. They simply believed that how a nation treats its enemies reveals who it truly is. And in those quiet, guarded fields of America, the world's most brutal war had given birth to one of its rarest moments of grace. The cultural shock and moral complexity of these camps would soon reach their breaking point, when surrender, mercy, and ideology collided with the approaching end of the war. For the Japanese prisoners, that moment of reckoning was yet to come. A winter of disbelief. The Christmas of 1944 snow fell over the fences of Camp McCoy that December. A soft, white silence settling over the Wisconsin plains. For the Japanese prisoners, the sight itself was foreign. Snow in their homeland meant New Year festivals, family gatherings, laughter, warmth. Here, behind barbed wire and watchtowers, it felt unreal. Another reminder that they were strangers in a land that did not fit the stories they had been told. The Americans, wrapped in wool coats and thick gloves, prepared for Christmas. The prisoners watched from their barracks as soldiers strung up electric lights and wreaths, their reflections glinting off frozen windows. Then something unexpected happened. The camp commandant ordered that every POW receive a special holiday meal, the same as the U.S. troops: roast turkey, mashed potatoes, bread, and even dessert. For men who had once starved in tropical caves, the smell of roasted meat alone was overwhelming. At first, many refused to eat, fearing poison or mockery. But the guards waited patiently, laughing among themselves, urging them to try. One Japanese sergeant finally lifted a fork. a gesture that broke the silence. Within minutes, the mess hall was filled with quiet chewing, clinking plates, and the sound of disbelief turning into acceptance. Later that night, an American chaplain stood outside the barracks playing a small portable organ. He sang Silent Night. The melody drifted through the camp, across snow and wire, into the barracks where dozens of Japanese soldiers sat listening. The song was strange, its rhythm unfamiliar, but its emotion universal. Some prisoners closed their eyes, imagining their own families far away. The moment carried no ceremony, no diplomacy, just shared stillness. The chaplain later wrote in his diary, "For a few minutes, there was no war, only men, cold and homesick, listening to the same song." That night became a quiet legend inside the camp. Years later, former prisoners would recall it as the moment they realized the Americans' kindness was not a trick. The Empire had promised cruelty. What they found was mercy. That contradiction shook something deep within them, something that no propaganda could rebuild. Letters home and the seeds of change. By early 1945, the transformation was no longer subtle. The War Department permitted supervised correspondence between prisoners and their families through the International Red Cross. The letters were brief, censored and often delayed for months, but they carried a new tone, one of confusion turning to clarity. In these letters, prisoners described their treatment in cautious but unmistakable terms. "We are alive," wrote one corporal from Camp Kennedy. "They feed us well and let us work. America is not what we were told." Such words, passing through neutral Swiss channels, reached Japan like distant echoes from another world. Military censors sometimes intercepted them, but fragments slipped through, spreading among civilians already exhausted by bombing and rationing. They began to question, quietly, dangerously, whether their leaders had told them the truth. American intelligence officers noticed the effect. Every letter home became, in its own way, a piece of psychological warfare. Without realizing it, the prisoners had become messengers of reality, undermining the myth of American barbarity that Tokyo had built for years. Inside the camps, lectures and re-education sessions continued. POWs were shown newsreels about the rebuilding of Europe, the Allied conferences, and even the American Constitution. Many wept during the footage of civilians living normal lives, grocery shopping, driving cars, walking freely in clean streets. Freedom, it turned out, had a sound, the moment of realization. The most striking transformation occurred not during any speech or class, but in the quiet of daily life. At Camp Trinidad, Colorado, a guard once dropped his rifle while climbing down from a tower. A Japanese prisoner working nearby immediately picked it up and handed it back. The guard froze, realizing the man could have turned it against him. Instead, the prisoner bowed. That gesture, simple, instinctive, deeply human, encapsulated what months of war could not destroy: mutual respect. By mid-1945, the line between enemy and captive had blurred in subtle ways. Prisoners organized concerts, sports matches, and art exhibitions. Americans attended them. A camp orchestra played Japanese folk songs one night and American marches the next. For both sides, it was a reprieve from hatred. For the Japanese soldiers, the emotional shift was profound. They had expected to die in disgrace. Instead, they were rediscovering life in captivity. The more they saw of America, its openness, its contradictions, its abundance, the more they realized that their own world had been closed, fragile, and controlled. One prisoner later wrote after repatriation, "We learned that power does not always roar. Sometimes it is quiet, confident, and just." It was a lesson that no battlefield could have taught. Yet the war outside raged on. News from Japan grew darker. Tokyo firebombed, Okinawa lost, families scattered. Within the camps, radios carried updates of advancing Allied forces, of atomic research whispered about in guarded tones. The prisoners knew the end was approaching, but not how it would come. The day America celebrated victory, many of these men would stand silently behind fences, unsure how to feel. They had been enemies, Yet part of them had already crossed a boundary far greater than any ocean, from fear to understanding. The world outside was collapsing, but inside those quiet American camps, a strange and irreversible change had begun, one that would shape Japan's future long after the war ended. August 1945. The sky that ended. Everything. In the sweltering summer of 1945, the air inside the POW camps felt charged, heavy with rumor. The guards grew quieter. Radios played longer than usual in the mess halls. Prisoners whispered among themselves. Something monumental had happened, something the Americans were not celebrating yet. Then came the headlines. Atomic bomb destroys Hiroshima. For the Japanese prisoners, the words were incomprehensible. Some refused to believe them outright. "No city can vanish in one bomb," muttered a sergeant at Camp McCoy. "It is American propaganda." But when the guards showed them photographs in U.S. newspapers, a flat, smoking plain where a city once stood, disbelief turned to shock. Many wept in silence. Others stared blankly at the images. The names, Hiroshima, then Nagasaki, were familiar, painfully intimate. For the first time, the distance between captivity and home felt unbearable. The men who had survived jungle battles and starvation now faced a truth too vast to understand. Their homeland was gone in pieces of light. That week, camp translators struggled to read official statements aloud. The emperor's voice, something no ordinary Japanese had ever heard, announced surrender on August 15th. In every camp across America, Japanese soldiers gathered by loudspeakers to listen. They stood motionless as the soft, distant voice broke through the static. "Endure the unendurable." Many fell to their knees. Some sobbed openly. Others remained standing, expressionless, as if time had stopped. The Americans, watching from a distance, understood that the prisoners' world had collapsed in that single broadcast. For these men, loyalty to the emperor had been sacred, the axis around which life revolved. Now that axis was gone. The silence, after victory when the war ended, the camps did not erupt in celebration. There were no cheers, no fireworks, only a long, aching quiet. The prisoners no longer had an enemy. They no longer had a country to fight for. The U.S. military, uncertain how to handle the emotional aftermath, maintained strict routine. Work continued. Meals were served. But the atmosphere had changed. Guards reported that prisoners spent hours writing, painting, or simply staring into the distance. Some formed small groups to discuss what Japan would become. Others recited poetry or sang nostalgic songs from home. At Camp Kennedy, one interpreter noted in his journal, "They are men without a war, without an emperor's command. For the first time, they are simply human beings." Small acts of compassion multiplied. American doctors treated sick prisoners more gently than ever before. Some guards shared cigarettes or letters from their own families. A few prisoners, hesitant at first, began to ask questions about democracy, about religion, about what would happen next. The most striking transformation occurred during the repatriation interviews conducted by U.S. intelligence officers. When asked what they expected of post-war Japan, several prisoners replied, "We wish our nation to be like this one, strong but kind." These words carried the weight of an ideological earthquake. Men who once vowed to die for the emperor were now speaking of liberty and fairness. Departure and the unspoken farewell. By late 1945, the repatriation process began. The camps, once full of tension, now filled with the rustle of duffel bags and quiet farewells. Trucks carried groups of Japanese soldiers to coastal ports, Seattle, San Francisco, New Orleans, where ships waited to return them to a homeland in ruins. The journey back was surreal. As the ships pulled away from American shores, many prisoners stood on deck, watching the coastline fade into mist. They had arrived as enemies. They left with something closer to gratitude. One American guard later wrote, "They bowed to us before boarding. Not out of fear but respect. We bowed back. Inside the holds of those repatriation ships, men shared stories, not of battles, but of kindness, of American medics who saved wounded prisoners, of chaplains who prayed for their dead, of guards who treated them as equals, even when they did not deserve it. They returned to a homeland that no longer resembled the empire they had once fought for. Cities flattened, families lost, the old order erased. But they carried with them a strange and powerful idea, that humanity could exist even in the heart of war. The quiet legacy, inside Japan. In the years that followed, historians traced something remarkable. Many of the Japanese POWs repatriated from America became voices of moderation in post-war society. Some became teachers, journalists, or civil servants who quietly advocated for democracy and reconciliation. They had seen with their own eyes what life under freedom looked like: clean streets, open newspapers, soldiers who questioned orders, and they had seen that mercy could conquer hatred more effectively than brutality. Their stories circulated in small memoirs, letters, and radio interviews. At first, few believed them. The shame of surrender was still too deep. But gradually their testimony helped shift Japan's perception of America from monster to mentor, a transformation that became the cornerstone of the U.S.-Japan alliance in the decades ahead. What began as captivity ended as education, and for those who had lived through it, the memory of those barbed wire winters, those unexpected meals, those shared songs, they remained as quiet proof that even in total war, the human spirit can defy its own propaganda. The war had ended, but something greater had begun: the slow rebuilding of trust between two former enemies. And within that fragile trust lay the seed of a future that neither side in 1942 could have imagined. The numbers behind the humanity by early 1946, the repatriation of Japanese prisoners from the United States, was nearly complete. Records from the Office of the Provost Marshal General showed that over 6,000 Japanese POWs had been held on American soil during the war. A small fraction compared to the hundreds of thousands of Germans and Italians interned, but unique in how they were treated and studied. Remarkably, the survival rate of these prisoners exceeded 98%. Compared to the brutal conditions faced by Allied POWs in Japanese camps, where death rates soared above 30%, this figure stood as an almost unbelievable contrast. It wasn't a coincidence. It was the result of deliberate American policy. From the very start, the U.S. War Department had issued orders to treat Axis prisoners in accordance with the Geneva Convention of 1929. The rationale was both moral and strategic. Humane treatment would protect the dignity of American forces if captured, but it also served a deeper psychological aim: to demonstrate to the world, and to the prisoners themselves, that democracy's strength lay not only in weapons, but in values. Inside the camps, prisoners received regular medical care, work pay, male privileges, and even education programs. Historians later uncovered that U.S. intelligence agencies saw the camps as laboratories of democracy, testing how exposure to American culture could influence enemy psychology. For the Japanese POWs, it was a revelation. Many had expected execution. Instead, they were taught English, shown movies, and even taken to American farms to assist with harvest work. One camp commander in Texas described them as the most disciplined and polite laborers we ever had. A nation in ruins. A lesson in restraint. When the ships finally returned them to Japan, the sight that awaited was one few could bear. Tokyo lay flattened, an ashen skeleton of what had once been the imperial capital. From the northern ruins of Sendai to the scorched ports of Nagasaki, the destruction was near total. The returning soldiers stepped off the ships not as heroes, but as ghosts from a vanished world. Many were interrogated by Japan's new government, some stigmatized for surrendering. Yet quietly they carried something profound: an alternate understanding of the enemy. American sociologists noted that many repatriated POWs exhibited what they called reversal admiration, a reluctant respect for the moral strength of their captors. Some spoke of their shock at how Americans allowed open criticism of leaders, something impossible under Japan's wartime regime. Others wrote of African American soldiers or Mexican laborers working freely beside white Americans, a social reality that defied the racial hierarchy Tokyo propaganda had claimed existed in the West. For many, this cultural shock reshaped their political outlook. Within a decade, some would participate in Japan's democratic reconstruction. As teachers, translators, even early civil rights advocates. But the greatest change was psychological. For the first time, Japan's soldiers, once conditioned to see mercy as weakness, had lived through a system where kindness was power. America's quiet experiment in Washington. Military planners and psychologists analyzed reports from the POW camps with great interest. The humane handling of Japanese prisoners had achieved unexpected results. The prisoners had become cooperative, even friendly toward their guards. They had produced essays, art, and data that revealed the inner workings of imperial military culture, information invaluable to post-war intelligence and occupation reforms, a classified war. Department memo in 1946 summarized the findings in a single sentence. Respect proved a stronger weapon than fear. This philosophy quietly informed the Allied occupation of Japan under General Douglas MacArthur. The approach was not one of vengeance, but reconstruction. American forces disarmed Japan's military, but preserved the emperor as a symbolic figure, understanding the cultural depth of that position. Reforms in education, labor, and governance followed the same principle tested in those POW camps. Firmness without cruelty. What had begun as a wartime necessity had evolved into a peacetime doctrine, that the defeated could be reshaped not through humiliation, but through dignity. As the U.S.-Japan relationship entered its post-war chapter, the lessons born behind barbed wire began to ripple outward, shaping policy, diplomacy, and the moral legacy of both nations. The war had ended in destruction, but from within the ashes, an unexpected alliance was beginning to take form. Japan's reckoning with defeat. The return of Japan's prisoners of war was not celebrated. It was mourned. In the early months of 1946, trains arriving from repatriation ports carried thin, sunburned men in ill-fitting uniforms through stations lined with silence. There were no flags, no family parades. For a society taught that surrender was worse than death, these soldiers embodied a painful contradiction. They had survived, but at a cost to their honor. Yet within this humiliation lay the seeds of transformation. Japan was a nation forced to look at itself without illusion. The myth of divine destiny, of racial superiority, of invincible armies, all had been reduced to rubble, as visible in the streets of Tokyo as in the faces of returning soldiers. American occupation officials, guided by their experiences with Japanese POWs, approached the reconstruction with remarkable restraint. They dismantled the war machine but left the spiritual framework intact. Schools reopened under new curricula. Newspapers printed freely. The emperor, now mortal in the eyes of his people, urged his subjects to pursue peace as the supreme ideal. Amid these sweeping reforms, the repatriated POWs quietly became bridges between two worlds. They had seen democracy up close, not as an ideology, but as a lived experience. In small villages and classrooms, they told stories of American fairness, of guards who shared rations, of doctors who treated Japanese wounds without hesitation. At first, people doubted them, but their sincerity, their refusal to glorify the war, carried weight. Slowly, their testimonies softened the edges of hatred. By the early 1950s, as Japan rebuilt its economy and entered the American-led security alliance, the moral framework planted in those POW camps had matured. The men once branded as cowards were now seen as witnesses to a different kind of strength, the strength to accept mercy and change. The American memory in the United States, the story of Japanese POWs never became a major narrative of victory. For most Americans, the focus remained on battles. Midway, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, the theaters of sacrifice and triumph. Yet among those who had served as guards, medics, and interpreters, the memory of the prisoners lingered. Many recalled how disciplined, polite, and deeply loyal their captives had been, even in defeat. One former guard from Camp McCoy wrote in a 1960 Veterans Journal, "They bowed to us, and we never knew whether it was respect or sorrow. Maybe both, but they taught me something, that enemies can still be human." In the broader American consciousness, the treatment of POWs became a quiet point of pride. It contrasted sharply with the brutality American soldiers had faced in Japanese hands, yet it stood as proof that the nation could rise above vengeance. The Geneva Convention, once seen as an idealistic formality, now had moral authority, because America had lived by it when it mattered most. Military academies studied the POW experience as a case study in psychological warfare through ethics, showing how compassion, paradoxically, could disarm the enemy more effectively than cruelty. The legacy that endured. Decades later, when U.S. and Japanese leaders met as allies rather than adversaries, few mentioned the POW camps directly. Yet their influence was everywhere. In the mutual respect between soldiers, in the cultural exchanges that flourished in the 1960s, and in the deep personal ties that defined the post-war alliance. Historians now view those camps as the first classrooms of reconciliation. Behind the fences and watchtowers, far from the battlefield, the two nations had unknowingly rehearsed the relationship they would one day share, one built not on domination, but understanding. The former prisoners who lived long enough to see this transformation often described it with quiet awe. One wrote in his memoir, "We expected to die in America. Instead, we learned how to live again." It was a sentence that captured the paradox of their experience, that captivity, when tempered by dignity, could become the birthplace of freedom. The war had burned away nations' illusions, but what rose from its ashes, the idea that enemies could find respect without surrendering their humanity, became one of the most enduring victories of all, and for those who had walked from the caves of Saipan to the farms of Texas, that realization would remain their truest lesson of the war. The story of the Japanese prisoners in America is not one of victory or defeat. It is one of awakening. In a war defined by unimaginable brutality, where hatred was carefully engineered and mercy seemed extinct, something unexpected survived. The quiet proof that decency could exist even between sworn enemies. For the Japanese soldiers, surrender had once meant the collapse of identity. They had been taught that to fall into enemy hands was worse than death, a stain upon the soul. Yet in the fields and workshops of faraway America, they discovered something their empire had never shown them, that strength and kindness could coexist. The same nation that destroyed their cities also healed their wounds. The same soldiers, they were told, would torture them instead shared food, laughter, and conversation. For the Americans, the presence of these men was a mirror. They were no longer faceless enemies from distant islands, but fathers, sons, and farmers caught in the same machinery of war. Compassion became a quiet act of victory, one that proved civilization could endure even amid total destruction. When those men finally sailed home to a Japan reduced to ashes, they carried no weapons, no banners, no songs of triumph. What they carried instead was memory, of a people who had shown restraint, of a system that valued mercy over revenge. And in that memory lay the foundation for a peace neither side had imagined possible. History often measures war by numbers: battles won, cities lost, lives taken. But sometimes, the truest measure lies in what survives unseen: a gesture of respect, a shared meal, a single act of humanity that refuses to die. The Japanese soldiers who arrived in America expecting death found something far more powerful: a glimpse of the world that could exist when war finally ends.